My name is Rob Murphy. I want to thank you guys for bringing me out here. I'm a native Michigander, and so it's funny to live out east, and everything is so consolidated. Like there are times I can say I work probably 40 miles from my house, and it takes me 3.5 hours to get home sometimes. So coming here, and there's really no traffic, and everything is spread out, is a beautiful thing. I just want you guys to know that. So again, let me get to kind of the presentation. So why are we talking about health? Why are we talking about education at a health equity conference? Well, the reality is this, is that there's a ton of research that says that if you don't graduate from high school, you've got more risk for other things. You've got more risk for bad health. And frankly, there's a possibility that you'll live 9 years less than somebody who actually did graduate from high school. So that's part of the reason we're having this conversation. And as the Reverend Starsky also put, there's a lot of things that are happening in education that actually impact you. If we think about like where we are downstream, you guys are further downstream. I'm going to suggest that education is the beginning of the stream. And what you see is kind of our failures, our planned failures and our unplanned failures, quite frankly. So I'm going to move forward. On your tables, there should be index cards. If there are not index cards, I ran out. Please take your pads, take one slice, one sheet of paper, and on the index card, write the first word or sentence that comes to mind when you think of male, female, Asian, African American, Hispanic, Latino, and white students. Meaning there should be 8 answers on your card, male and female for each group. Flip your card over or flip your paper over when you're done, or if you have a piece of paper, you can fold it. Now, we're going to come back to those cards in a second, but the first thing I think we need to talk about is this whole issue of race. When you guys see me, what do you see? Black man, 6'3", 200-something pounds. But you see an African-American man. Now, you don't see that my grandfather was from Chile. My grandmother was from Trinidad and Tobago. My other grandmother was a biracial product of a biracial relationship. The majority of her family lives in Chatham, Ontario. I only have one grandfather actually from this country, who's actually born in this country. My grandfather was born, Melvin Luapu Crawford was born actually in Little Rock, Arkansas. So we're going to have a little conversation about this notion of race. The reality is that you see me as a 6'3" African-American man. But I just told you my background. So what could I claim? I could claim Hispanic, Latino. I could claim, obviously, African-American. And depending on what you really want to talk about race, I actually probably could claim white, even though I don't look white, obviously. So this notion of race is a real interesting concept in the United States. I have a buddy I work with, Asim. Asim is Egyptian. Does everybody know in the census that in the census it says if you are North African or from the Middle East, you're considered white? Now, my buddy Asim is darker than I am. And Asim says, Robert, what does this mean? I'm not white, I'm black. I'm black. He's actually gone to court to fight to be black. But the census says, no, Asim, you're white. And Asim is in his feelings about being white because he's an African. He's dark, again, darker than I am. But he is, by American standards, he is white. And this whole notion of race is a very interesting concept in regards to the United States. How many Irish and Italian people we got in here? By show of hands. Irish and Italian. You guys just got to be white about 90 years ago. Just the reality. We need to understand what this concept is and what it's about, because the reality is with race in this country, while there is, and when we look even across the planet, there is no real issue of race. Like, you're not going to cut me, I'm going to bleed blood, and cut him, he's going to bleed cotton candy. But the concept of race, while there is no real physical or biological premise to it, there is certainly a social, economic, and political construct that people live every day. And quite frankly, as a young boy growing up in Detroit, I lived. You know, you talked about being a police officer. In Detroit, we used to have the Big Four. The Big Four was a group of police officers, typically white, who would roll up in a Plymouth Grand Fury. And whenever they rolled up, people would say, Big Four, and we scatter. Now, you didn't have to be the fastest. You just didn't need to be the slowest. Because the slowest meant, and we all adults here, slowest meant you get your ass whooped. and you get taken. Detroit is based on the mile system. So we have 5 miles, 6 miles, 7 mile. Eminem made 8 mile very popular. Well, the Detroit police would take you out to 32 mile. And at that time, there were no cell phones. And they take your wallet. So what were you doing from 32 mile back to 7 mile? You were walking. Or unless you had a phone in your house and you could call collect somebody. So the reality, again, is that the notion of race, while we don't have any biological differences, there certainly are social, political, and economic constructs. So let's talk about this in the United States, because this conversation that we have right now is really about we're all equal. We're all equal. Doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter your gender, doesn't matter anything. I've had people say to me, I'm from New England, we're good blue Democrats. As if being from New England and being a blue Democrat meant that you couldn't have some type of racial bias. I don't see color. In the context of education, how do you not see color? Quick story as a teacher. I was teaching my kids math. I had one young man, I was teaching in the juvenile justice facility. And I was teaching them fractions and decimals. So in the book it said, John had 3 slices of pizza, Sally ate 2.8 or 2 1/8, John ate 3 1/8, and somebody else ate 5 1/8. And so my boys looked at me like, Mr. Murphy, what the hell is this? In my family, we eat a slice of pizza, or we eat a half a slice of pizza. We don't eat a slice of pizza, we eat the whole pizza. So when we got to have it, we continued to have this conversation. I said to him, well, and I'm not, wait a minute, are there any educators in the room? Any educators? Okay. I'm not going to suggest that you use my method. I'm just going to say what I did. So, most of my boys were locked up for selling dope. So what I said to him was, if you sold $1,000 worth of dope, how much money would you get? I get $200. So you get 20% or 0.20 of this. Oh, that's how you do this, Mr. Murphy? Yeah, that's how you do this. Oh, and the boys moved on with flying colors. So I say a lot to say that their experiences, and I'm not suggesting that their race necessarily correlated with their experiences, but my population was locked up. There's certain things that happened when they're locked up, and most of them have been locked up because they were dealing drugs or got involved in something else. But to not see their color and to not see people's experiences is really doing yourself a disservice, as the Reverend talked about earlier, which is learning about the community. We have so many people outside the community dictating what's happening in the community and saying what the community is or isn't when ain't nobody talk to the damn community. That irresponsible. I don't see gender, and I'll just talk about this because this isn't necessarily colorblind, but this is gender blindness. Years ago, I received a letter from a young lady from Baltimore County Public Schools. She said, Mr. Murphy, I'm so sick of learning in health class about sexual education. She proceeded to tell me that she takes issue with the fact that she gets taught as a young lady how not to get raped. She said, why do we teach women not to get raped? Why don't we teach boys not to rape? Now, let me be very clear. As an African-American man who has a daughter and obviously a wife, I'd never thought about it in those terms of things are taught from a male perspective. And so when we look at this whole thing of race and we start intersecting race and class and race and gender, the reality is as an African-American man, yes, there are certain things that I receive as a consequence of my African-American maleness, but there's also things I receive as a positive as being an African-American male. Oftentimes people look at me and say, you're an athlete. Yeah, I was. And there's a social capital that's associated with that notion of being an athlete. But let me move forward. So those cards that you filled out, I've done this activity. You guys have probably pushed me over about 3,500. Consistently what I get for Asian students is Asian male and female, smart, high performers, driven, hardworking, high performing, sweet, quiet, beautiful. When we look in school context, what does that mean for those students? That means that they get the benefit of the doubt. That means that when they are being taught, they're being taught by educators who say they can do the work. So I'm going to challenge them. I'm going to have higher expectations because I know they're smart. They can do it. I know they're going to be diligent. But here's the funny part about this whole notion of Asianness, because there's this whole model of being the model minority. Well, the reality is when you start looking at Asians and you have to look at where people are from, because the reality is when you start looking at Southeast Asians, their performance is very similar to that of African American and Latinos. So this whole notion that Asians are the model minority and brilliant, yeah, there are some Asians absolutely brilliant, but there are some who are struggling. And because of how we perceive young people in classes, it's how we treat them. And so an Asian who might be struggling with reading, we ignore, because all Asians are smart, right? They're brilliant. They can all do math. They're smart. Next group. So when you look at this, we look at white, privileged. The green is all positive, or positive things that are thrown out about people. They're privileged. Okay, cool. Red means that that's probably negative, and we'll get to the other ones. Superior for white males is what I've received. Also, the most interesting thing I received is white males are serial killers. But as you notice here, the green outnumber the red and the yellow. So let's look at Hispanic. ELL, English language learners. Hardworking, teenage mothers. Is every Latino female a teenage mother? I actually asked a gentleman one of the times who filled this out. He said he had 100 Latinas in his class or in his school. He had 2 that actually got pregnant, but he put down teenage mothers. 100, okay. Struggle, macho, don't value education, gangs, and then welfare munchers. Now again, what's the impact? The impact is every Latino kid that comes through the building can't speak English, or at least that's the perception. And again, the expectations go down. There are a whole cascade of things that happen in regards to who these kids are. Now let's look at African American. You don't see any yellow and you see very little green. Now I struggle to put tough as a co-green and co-red, and I use the athletic piece as a co-green and co-red. But you see here, where's the positive? So the question is, how does this impact African Americans? Low expectations? No expectations. Thank you. That's even better. No expectations. Negative expectations. Negative treatment. When we look at even some of the fights in schools, and there was a situation that happened in Wilmington, Delaware last week. What we see, particularly from African American females, is a rage and an anger of their experience in school. And we're going to talk about that in a second, but I think it's important to see. In reality, as I talked about us being further up the stream, this is what you guys are dealing with as health people, or as health field. Part of the reason is because I think when we look at racism, we think about it in its active context. We think about the Klan. Well, I'm not the Klan, so I ain't no racist. We think about, anybody know that the Latinos back in the southwestern United States were hung just like African Americans because they were too bougie, they were too this, they had too much property, they thought themselves too high. This poor brother right here, and I always forget his name, but this brother here, white man, rode the bus with the Freedom Riders down in Mississippi. He got off the bus and said, I will take a beating because I think by the time they get done beating me, they're going to be too tired to mess with y'all. There's always been a camaraderie and a connection between African Americans and whites and African Americans and Latinos. Again, this is African. But again, this is what we see as racism. This is an index card that was, not an index card, a postcard that was sent out to families in the mid-40s. They are hanging or mocking hanging an 8-year-old African American male. And again, this is what we see as racism. But I'm going to suggest to you, we really got more subtle racism that happens every day that we don't pay any attention to, and we act as if it doesn't exist. So let's talk about school discipline, in education. Looks like school discipline, expectations, referral to special ed, gifted and talent, teaching resources, etc. Injustice, we talked about Michael Brown earlier, but I'm going to suggest again, we start talking about racism and what it looks like, it is contextual. So in injustice, it looks like brothers running down the street and getting shot in the back. it looks like black men getting longer time or black people receiving longer time in prison for the same offenses that white people might get or other groups might get. In housing, it looks like black neighborhoods being devalued, white neighborhoods being excessively valued. Then when the blacks buy the houses in the white neighborhoods, the housing value goes down, and the whites come back in, and they take the black neighborhood for $30,000. And so the property value goes up where the blacks came from, and it goes down where the blacks go. And we don't really have a metric, at least as far as I've gone into realtors.com and everything else. I've never seen a metric on how we determine what the housing values are. It is determined by who lives where. And then let me go back. And then we look at the socioeconomic impact. People say get over slavery. Now, I'm going to ask you guys a question, and I want you guys to do this for me. I want you to work for me for 1 full year for nothing. You're shaking your head like, hell no, I ain't doing that. Anybody want to work for me for free for a year? 12 weeks? You give me a week? That's pretty generous, because I don't think I've ever had anybody give me a week. But the reality is this, is that you know how much you make, and if you took a year off, what would happen? If you could work for me for free, or if I could have your skill and your abilities for free to make my own money, help me understand how I need to get over and how there shouldn't be a problem. Because what you had is free labor. Certainly not everybody had free labor, but certainly groups had free labor, and that is kind of what this country has been built upon, quite frankly. There was a recent thing in Georgetown University where Georgetown sold 300 slaves to stay afloat. Ivy League schools were built primarily by African-American slaves. So again, how does this play out in schools? Well, this comes from Are We Closing the School Discipline Gap? Dan Lowson, Dan and I are buddies, but this is elementary out-of-school suspension for Missouri public schools. And we're going to talk I'm going to show you a little bit more data about Missouri public schools. Why are they being suspended? Disrespect, insubordination, et cetera, so forth. The first time I was suspended, I was in the 7th grade. I asked the teacher, Mr. Vandenberg, can you explain to me what the difference is between Chapter 5, the United States expanding westward, and Chapter 11, Hitler conquering westward? I don't understand what the difference is. 7th grade. He said, what'd you say? I repeated my question. Now, let me give you some background, too. Now, Mr. Vandenberg, I'm going to be totally honest. There was a situation when we were talking about slavery in class, and a white classmate, Timothy Adams, said, at least my ancestors weren't a bunch of spear-chucking monkeys. I got up out of my chair, I choked him, I slapped him, and I was kicked out of class. That was our prehistory. But at this particular time, I'm trying to ask what I think is a legitimate question. What is the difference between Hitler conquering westward and the United States expanding westward? Because both groups had somebody living westward. He looked at me and said, you can get out of my class. You're being disrespectful. I said, what? I didn't do anything. He said, yes, you are. You're being disrespectful. You need to get out. And so I was suspended for a day. Now, I had slapped the kid and threw a kid out of the desk, but I wasn't suspended. But when I asked the question, I was suspended. And I want to suggest to you that this is what we see primarily for African-American students, regardless of who they are. It is disrespect, insubordination, disorderly conduct. It is all these things that oftentimes are really related to what they say, what they ask, and how they ask it. If you look at Missouri secondary suspensions, again, 27% for African-Americans. It's not looking that bad for other groups of kids. So this is what I pulled down from the Missouri State Department of Education's website. Now, I'm going to show you something that's really interesting to me, because in Maryland, we just report suspensions. We report 10 days, 10 or more days and expulsions, and we report like the 1 and 2 days and 3 dayers. Each incident to be reported, students are removed from 10 or more consecutive days. Why is this important? Because this is the old way the special ed does it. So you don't really get an accurate depiction of what is really happening in your buildings. Most suspensions are not for 10 days. As a matter of fact, at least in Maryland, you're looking at maybe 1%, 2%, maybe 3% tops of our suspensions out of 900,000 kids is actually 10 or more days. And for us, it is an expulsion. This is what you report on your statewide website. Now, here's the deal. Most suspensions are between 1 and 5 days. So if you don't have to report, or you don't report the numbers, conceivably, you could be suspending kids like you're giving out candy at Halloween. You take 3, you take 5, you take 3, you take 6. And again, there's nothing that's collecting or tracking the data. Somebody talked about Normandy, Riverview Gardens. Now, unfortunately, as an outsider, I don't know where these places are. My assumption is some of these are probably near St. Louis and some are in Kansas City. But even Kansas City, any thoughts? I do call and response too. I just do a little bit more with the numbers. Mm-hmm. Now, when you think about this, again, let's think about this in context of school. So if I am missing or if I'm removing these types of kids for 10 or more days, normal instructional day is probably 200 minutes, maybe 300 minutes, depending on how many courses a day you have. In some cases, you could be talking about kids missing millions of instructional hours. When you look at how this is impacting, particularly the larger systems with African American or Latino or First Nation people. And again, this is what the state of Missouri actually reports. Yes, yes, yes. And so in Maryland, which was very interesting to me, when I looked at, we report unduplicated kids and we report duplicated kids. Because to your point, you have to know if it's one kid getting suspended 3 times or if it's 5 kids being suspended 20 times. And again, I couldn't discern that from the data that was available. And as we start talking about some of the solutions, the other parts of this conversation is when you try to do deeper data dives, I don't necessarily know that you can do the deeper data dives as a community. And that's the challenge for people who are trying to hold people accountable. But I'm going to suggest to you that most of these are probably African American, particularly in Kansas City, Riverview, Normandy, and St. Louis. This is just my assumption, and this is what the data normally tells me. So when you think about this, this is probably a predominantly African American, probably male and female. So let's talk a little bit about inclusion for African American, First Nation, and Latino students. How are African Americans included? I talked about my experience earlier. Excuse me. Very much like most other urban areas, as I grew up in Detroit, I was shot at 6 times. The 6th time, my mother said, you have to go up to Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where her family is from. Now, anybody know anything about Grand Rapids? Okay, Grand Rapids. You're from Michigan. Okay. Detroit, all black. Grand Rapids, all white. There's a cultural conflict. When I left Detroit, everybody I had, my mayor, my police chief, everybody was black. When I moved to Grand Rapids, everybody in power was white. Now, what also came with me, and we start talking about what happens with students who are suspended, is there's this, the Reverend talked about people getting cases. And I'm going to suggest to you in schools that there is some social and academic consequences to being the condemned or the troubled kid. So I was Robert from Detroit. I was the kid from Detroit, the bad kid. Now, never mind, I'm going to date myself, my California Achievement Test. In the 6th grade, I scored as a freshman in college in reading and reading comprehension and scored as a 12th grader in math and math comprehension. Nobody saw that. They saw the kid from Detroit. And so that proceeded to, or that helped me get suspended even more, because no matter what I did, I was wrong. But how did that change for me? That changed when I became eligible for football. And I became all-city and all-state. And then some of the same stuff I was doing when I was hoodlum Robert, like getting up in the middle of class and going to Burger King. That stuff I was doing then, as a star football player, the security staff and the teachers were saying, Murph, give me a Whopper with cheese. Tell them hold onions. Murph, give me some fries. So my experience, I went from here, condemnation, to here, where I could do whatever I wanted to do. The funny part, though, is for my buddies who were 5'2" and 110 pounds, they didn't have that. They were either invisible or, depending on who they associated with, they were condemned. And here's the other parts of this conversation, particularly in relationship to schools. See this young lady right here? Now, don't pay attention to the hedges behind her because Daddy hadn't trimmed the hedges in a while. But that's my daughter. She's now 20. She's in Africa. But when she was 16, I was down at the Maryland General Assembly, and I was testifying. I get a text. Daddy, I'm about to get expelled. So I text back, oh, baby, something wrong with your autocorrect, because it said you're about to get expelled. I know you ain't going to get expelled. Autocorrect is off today. She said, no, Daddy, seriously, I'm about to get expelled. I'm testifying before the Maryland General Assembly. I get in my truck. I drive back up to Baltimore, find out that this young lady, who was the captain of the softball team, who had a 3-point-something or other, IB, International Baccalaureate student, doing everything she's supposed to do. Now, let me also add that her mother passed when she was 13. So she stayed on course. She's doing everything she's supposed to do, but she's about to get expelled. Why? Well, Daddy feeds her teammates. So I give her every game day, I give her a backpack full of snacks, granola bars, juices, chips, you name it, so she can distribute to her teammates, because guess what? Her teammates either can't afford lunch, don't like lunch, or don't eat lunch. And we got double headers. My daughter's distributing the food. Teacher said, you're selling food, snatches her bag, tells her, get out, she's going to the office, you about to get expelled. Or no, you're about to get suspended. She taps him on the shoulder and says, can I get my purse and my bag, or my purse and my notebook? He says, you just assaulted me. Now, what's partially interesting about this story is that this is what I hear from African American students a lot, because I manage the state's discipline policies. I didn't hit him. In some cases, people do get hit, and they should be expelled because you should not be hitting teachers. But in most cases, what I hear is this. And as a former administrator, I have separated my shoulders stopping the fight. That didn't mean that the young lady should have been expelled because I got injured. That just means that I fell to the floor. So I said, let's say, now she's fine now, but the reality is that because I was her dad and because I wrote the state discipline policy, I could actually say to the principal, hey, let's open up your computer. Let's look at that report right there. Whose name is that? That's Robert Murphy, right? That would be Kaya Murphy, so that means we're not going here, are we? No, we're not going here. As far as I'm concerned, her consequences are fine. But here's the important piece of this. I'm a middle-class educated parent. I can leave the Maryland General Assembly. I got time. I got paid for the whole day. I got a truck. I can get in and drive up the road. What happens when mom works at Kmart or Walmart or KFC or whatever it is? She can't take that time. But her consequence, had I not been who I was, would have been that she got expelled. How does that make sense? And so when we talk about systems of racism and systems of oppression, again, we're upstream. I will say this in the last piece about race, and I think race and racism in this country is like rain. We're all standing in it, but most of us refuse to acknowledge that we're getting wet. We're all getting wet. So our wetness could be that when I'm doing discipline policy in Maryland, I have an African-American administrator who stands up and says, black boys are disrespectful and they should be suspended. This whole conversation about school discipline oftentimes is leveraged as these mean white people doing this stuff to these poor black kids. And the reality is there are some mean white people who are doing these things to poor black kids, but there's also some mean black people doing these things to poor black kids. And we have to have that conversation, and we're not unpacking this whole notion of race and how it impacts us in our lives. So how do we survive in the rain? Yeah, get undercover, amen. Systemic ways for increasing school completion. Academic access opportunities. That same daughter I was telling you about in middle school had a 3.8 GPA, was taking 2 high school courses. Her only B was because she didn't get dressed for gym. That was why she got a B. Me and her mother tried to get her into gifted and talented. They told us there's no room for her. We don't think she can do the work. She got 3.8. She's taking high school courses in middle school, and you don't think she can do the work? What? Well, we don't have space. Well, I'll buy her a chair. Well, no, me and her mother fought to get her in gifted and talented for 2 years. Academic access opportunities. This is what we're talking about when we start talking about equity. We've got tons of African-American children that could excel in gifted and talented programs, yet don't get the opportunity because oftentimes there is no criteria. It's very interesting to me. We have conversations about who gets into what and why, but things like these are real soft, quite frankly. It's really subjective. It is, I as a teacher think you can make it, and I don't think you can make it. And the reality is, too, even for poor whites, rural Missouri, this is happening, too. Deeper data dives. I pulled some information about Normandy School District. Well, actually, I pulled about the school districts you saw. I looked at graduation and for different groups. I noticed that for African Americans, the year you mentioned, Reverend, when they became Normandy Collaborative, the year prior, the graduation rate was 63% cohort for African American students. Somehow, from 2014 to 2015, that number had jumped to 75%. Now, where I'm from, folk kind of hustle you. I'm not suggesting that Normandy is hustling people, but what I'm suggesting is we have to ask deeper questions in those data dives. How do we go from 63% graduation rate to 75% in 1 year? Were we passing out diplomas like they were tacos at Taco Bell? Like how do we get to that? Did they lower the standards? Exactly. I've been places. Matter of fact, I'm glad you said that because that makes me think of a place I used to work at, a residential treatment facility that said we reduced holds 86% in the first year of working. No, we didn't. What we did was change the definition of a hold. And the definition of a hold went from any time you put your hands on a kid to where you hold the kid for 10 or more minutes. Now, most people who work in residential facilities know that a hold typically takes you 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Kid de-escalates and you move on. But we changed the definition to make ourselves look good. So deeper data dives, grading practices. One of the things I work with local school systems in Maryland is oftentimes when kids don't turn in work, and our kids are not the most organized. I know we give them organizers and all that stuff in middle school, but the reality is many of them are unorganized. Oftentimes in Maryland, kids were getting zeros for not turning in their work. So if you get 100 on one paper, you get a 0 on the other paper, your cumulative grade is 50, which makes you fail. Is that really an accurate depiction of the student's ability? Or is that just some double penalty that we put in place for kids to actually hammer them? So what we did was we changed that policy. All school systems haven't adopted it, but many have, which is what we changed is that the kid will get the minimum failing score in that system. So the minimum failing score is 50. They get a 50 versus a 0. Because a 50 plus a 100 gives you 150, and the cumulative is a 75, which is probably a more accurate prediction of the kid's performance than actually giving them a 0, which would drop them down to a 50. The other thing is we talked about, and I'll talk about reforming discipline practices in a second, technology and accountability practices. Talked about gifted and talented materials. I was in a school where African-American students are. Richard Nixon was still the president. And this was 2010. Y'all remember Tricky Dick, right? Teacher allocation. This is, to me, one of the more important things. We start talking about equity that does not happen. And we don't really, because non-educators don't know how the system works. So I'm going to give you a little hint. In most cases, poor kids, whether they're rural whites, rural poor whites, or they are African Americans, regardless of what their social class is, are often taught by teachers who have been fired or who have been removed from another place. They've typically failed in another building. And so these kids are getting, I won't call them the worst, but they're getting people who have failed in a place where it's pretty easy not to fail. So you're giving these kids who are, in some cases, the most needy, in some cases who need the skill building, people who probably can't give them the skill building. And then on top of that, you say that the kids are wrong. Oh, look at these kids. Look at this achievement gap. But you give them the worst resources and expecting the best results. That doesn't make any sense to me. Perhaps it's just me, though. Enrichment opportunities. Pastor talked about earlier all the programs that are in the community. We need more effective programs in the community. We don't need more programs. We need more effective programs. And we need to be able to measure their effectiveness and ability. And then alternative options. It is criminal that a kid gets past the 3rd grade and can't read in the public school system. Like, I truly believe you should be locked up. Because it's easy identification who can't read in the kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, et cetera, so forth. And we don't do that. In my opinion, we need to hold those people accountable. The other piece is we don't teach reading after the 3rd grade. So if you can't read by 3rd grade, you're in trouble. We don't teach. The assumption is by 3rd grade, you've got it. And so we start giving you lessons that say you got it. Whether you got it or not is really irrelevant. And here's the important piece. Kids in elementary school are not earning credit, so we can actually extract them for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is, give them intensive service, intensive supports, and then send them back with their group. It's not like they're in high school. Everybody know who this is? Okay, yeah. So I put this picture up. Some young folks don't know who this is, but us old folks know who this is. This is what's her name, Linda Blair from the movie The Exorcist, where she spit out green pea soup. So let's talk a little bit about what happened in Maryland. So when I started at the department, 2006, we have 900,000 students in Maryland. We were suspending 182,000 students per year. You're talking about 24, 23% of our population. And most, and let me break down the 182,000. 108,000 were African American. Of those 108,000, 75 or 76,000 were African American males, 32,000 were African American females. Again, mostly for being smart, being surly, being rude, being whatever, not necessarily for violence. Oh, but we were getting black kids. We was also getting white kids too, though. Let's of those 182,000, 62,000 were white kids. About 45,000 of those were white males. About 17,000 were white females. So we was getting them all. When we start looking at our numbers, though, something was very apparent. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, about the notion of disrespect and subordination. 80% of the suspensions for the African American students were related to disrespect and subordination, et cetera. So as you guys leave here and you go out into your communities, think about those terms: disorderly conduct, disrespect, insubordination, et cetera, so forth, because those are the reasons why your kids are being suspended. Now I'm going to ask you guys a quick question. By a show of hands, who thinks the suspension rates or the suspension numbers are higher from the transition to elementary to middle school? Meaning the suspension rate jumps from elementary to middle or middle to high. By those who believe elementary to middle, please raise your hand. Okay. Those who believe it's middle to high, please show your hand. Okay. Those who voted first are actually right. When I look at this data across the state, and I'm sure Missouri is probably no different, the number of suspensions doubles, triples, or even quadruples from elementary to middle. What drives those suspensions? Insubordination, disrespect. In Maryland, we used to have this wonderful topic called refusal to obey school rules. When I asked principals what refusal to obey school rules was, they said it's catch-all. If I can't get them on something, I can't get them on everything else, I'll get them on this. I'm sorry. If they didn't do anything wrong, why are they being suspended? But okay, whatever. I talked about the driver suspension increase, and we were using more OSS, frankly, than we were using ISS. So reforming our practice, we did some serious data dives, and I kind of mentioned it earlier when I talked about the data, but systemic versus concentrated. I do a report every year that looks at What are the highest suspending schools? Now, I recognize that based on the data we saw from Missouri Department of Education, that's going to be a harder dig or harder dive for you guys. But what I found was, a couple years ago, 75 schools, 53 high schools, 20 middles, and 2 alternative schools. Of the 53 high schools, they represented 90% of all high school suspension in the state of Maryland. We've got 300 high schools. 53 represented 90% of all high school suspension in the state of Maryland. Those 20 middle schools, they were 70% of all the middle school suspension in the state. So what I'm going to suggest to you is this, is that certainly there are some systemic problems that you have, but I'm be willing to bet that you probably can identify what schools have the issues, and you need to target those schools with intense services, and also, we'll talk about that in a second. Revising the code of conduct, I talked about earlier, that whole notion of refusal to obey school rules and insubordination. I redid the code of conduct, and I eliminated those 2 categories. There's a lot of consternation about that, to which people shut down my email, 6,000 emails. Mr. Murphy, you're a horrible parent. You don't want to hold kids accountable. You don't want to do these things. You want to do these things. You're a horrible person. You know, you have no standards. What about the good kids? And that's what this conversation oftentimes in school discipline is about, good and evil. The good kids versus the bad kids. When in fact, they're kids. And while I'm speaking about this particular thing, let me also talk about the type of language that we use. Offenders, offending, sanctions, crimes, civil infractions, et cetera, so forth. Let's be very clear. When a kid steals a car, the kid is committing a crime. If I curse you out, I'm not committing a crime. I might be rude. I might be nasty. But as a 15 or 16-year-old, that's kind of, anybody raised a teenager before? Maybe it was me, but, you know, teenagers got a whole lot going on. And when you can get a smile out of them, that's a good deal. Revising the code of conduct is one of the things we did. And then the other piece is behavior and classroom competence. Teachers do not get professional development or be trained on how to classroom manage. We don't. When we're trained, it's instruction, 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 school law, instruction, 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 instruction. There is a presumption in education that you as a teacher know how to build relationships, hold kids accountable, and deliver whatever subject matter you're delivering or you're teaching. The reality is that in most cases, the teachers I've talked to say it takes at least 4 to 5 years to actually gain that skill, where you've got your classroom manager down, where you've got your structures down, where you've got all the things you need to have to be successful in the classroom. And what we do in America is, unlike other nations, we just send them out there. Japan, they get support. Germany, they get support. Finland, they get support. All these places, they don't send kids out green. They say, okay, you can teach for a half a day, you teach for a few hours, you sit under a teacher who is actually an established teacher who's got credibility, you learn from that person, you observe that person. No, not in America, we just push them out. Figure it out. And meanwhile, while you're figuring it out, mess up a whole bunch of other kids too, while you're doing it. Staff, racial, gender, socioeconomic disability awareness, and accountability. This is a challenge for us because while we talk about equity and we talk about all these things, I'm not sure that we really want accountability. Because accountability means some people might lose their jobs. Accountability means that some people might not be the great guy that they are. And I see this happening in education a lot, and I see it even happening in my state where we don't want to identify even places where we got issues. Oh, well, I know that guy. He's a good guy. Well, he might be a great guy, but he might suck with kids. And if we've got disparities with his children, he needs to go. I'm sorry. Relationship building and relationship building training, which is certainly what teachers need and what school systems need, because we have this mismatch, as the Reverend was talking about, our pastor was talking about, with the community and the people that are being served. Y'all got Teach for America here too? Teach for America? Yeah. 5-year training program. And then they unleash them to schools of color. And I have nothing against Teach for America. I'm not saying anything against them. What I'm suggesting is I think it is pathetic to experiment on people who don't need to be experimented upon. Kids who are struggling don't need to be experimented on. They need proven tactics, strategies, people. Not people who are going to be around for 2 years and then dip out. Accountability practices, talked a little bit about data already. Hiring and removal practices. Most people say you can't fire teachers. I disagree. It takes a while. You have to certainly document, but you certainly can remove teachers. But the other thing is, and this is where you guys are important in regards to who your superintendents are and all that, you've got to hold them accountable. Go to board meetings. You guys got board elections here? You elect your, find people who are aligned with who you want and what you want. And if you can't find them, create them. Create your own platforms. Have expectations for performance. Here's the funny part with this notion of performance. We have expectations for performance, attendance, and, well, in most places, culture and climate. We don't have one for suspension. So what we basically said to administrators is, suspend that will. Do what you want to do. It's your building. We actually need to reel them in, too, because, quite frankly, they are destroying a whole lot of lives and a whole lot of kids. North Carolina. Pastor, you talked about earlier about early childhood education. I'll let you guys read this for a second. However, the gaps returned as the students enrolled in first, second, and third grades. Why? Because they were transitioning to schools oftentimes where there isn't a whole lot of quality instruction. And so whatever gains you might have, you end up losing. School level solutions. Data dies where I talked about that school climate and culture. When I was in the building, we had kids who were being suspended left and right, stopped suspension, but also took this group and made them my advisory committee. So they were telling me what I needed to do in schools to improve the climate and the culture. And as a matter of fact, these young people didn't get suspended at all. Matter of fact, most of them transitioned from the school without a suspension after we made them the group or the advisory council. Schools are about love. Improving the 3 R's. Rigor, relationship, and relevance. Rigor, relationship, and relevance. Targeting the most vulnerable students. Here's the funny part about these folks is that they're most like religious converts. If you can get them to invest and believe, they will sell the rest of the school. You can turn your whole building around. But the key for them is you got to show them that you about that life, as the kids say. Including students and solutions, I talked about that already, and then revisiting parent engagement. Academic rigor, I'm just going to give you some examples. By show of hands, who believes lesson A is more rigorous than lesson B? And I'm going to let y'all read that for a second. Those who believe lesson A is more rigorous than lesson B, please raise your hand. Those who believe lesson A is more rigorous than lesson B, please raise your hand. Rigorous meaning it's more intense, it's more deliberate, you have to do a little bit more thinking about it. Lesson A, anybody? Going once, going twice? I have seen this type of lesson in high schools, all over the place. This isn't critical thinking. Remember, neatness counts. That's an actual high school lesson. Obviously, B is more rigorous than the other. Take a moment and think about your favorite teacher and educator and why. Now think about your least favorite educator. I was in Bahamas last year doing a presentation, and this lady came up to me after everything was done. I was like, I still remember her. It was 60 years ago, and I still remember her. And so I say all that to say that teachers have a tremendous impact on who we become, what we think about ourselves, what we believe about ourselves. And I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in the 6th grade, Ernestine Jackson, my middle school English teacher, My mom and I had been evicted. We were sleeping in a 78 Cutlass at Marygrove College in Detroit. I wrote a paper, and I don't know if anybody knows about 78 Cutlass. Like, we didn't have the push-button lights. You had the dial that you turned, and it was this really raggedy light. I'm sitting in the back. I did my homework anyway. Ms. Jackson walks up to me, and she says, baby. She didn't say it loud. She knew my circumstance. She said, baby. She said, I expect better than this. I don't really care about what your circumstances are. So at lunchtime, me and you are going to sit together, and we're going to rewrite this paper because I know you're better than this, and you can perform better than this. Now, while I was a bit frustrated, Ms. Jackson said, regardless of my circumstances, I got expectations for you. You're too smart. I expect you to do well, regardless of what happens. I had another instructor at Morgan State University. As you guys see, I'm 6'3". Dr. Johnson was 5'2". Dr. Johnson gave me a paper one day that looked like he had spilled SpaghettiOs on my paper. He said, Mr. Murphy, your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, your community, and I expect better than this. And when he gave me my paper, I was looking up at him versus me looking down at him like I know did. And I say all that to say that these people are my favorite educators, but I can also, again, think about those people who are most challenging to us. So what students say real quickly is, this comes from Philadelphia. You give me better relationships between teachers and students, and I'll be invested, and I'll go. So what do relationships look like in schools? As the adult, I won't even say schools. This is people interacting with each other. If you can provide safety, emotional, intellectual, and physical safety, we down. You be consistent. You communicate. You have expectation. You have honesty. You have double expectation. And you have care. These are all actions that the adults provide. If you can provide those things, I can provide trust. If I can provide trust, I begin to provide investment. I provide investment, I provide confidence, and then I provide performance. Now, let me be very clear. My performance might look like I don't come to school 4 days a week and I start coming 2 days a week. So I miss 3. Or my performance looks like I might do 50 work, but now I'm doing 57 work. But that's what performance looks like. And particularly for the most vulnerable students that we have, you got to engage them emotionally, because if you don't, you get nothing from them. See, for them, you got to show that you care, because adults have failed them. And once you do that, you've got the behavior and all that stuff. Relationships to me are very much like currency. I know all you guys in here make boatloads of money, because I know State of Missouri and y'all's programs pay y'all big money. So I know that. But relationships are very much like a currency. It's a social currency. And so when I'm in school and I discipline a kid, if I've got a wonderful relationship with that kid believes, oh, Mr. Murphy's not, he doesn't dislike me. I did something wrong, and he's correcting my behavior. Far too often, in the communities that I cited and that I showed, we don't have no credits, but we're trying to hold people accountable. And so when I'm going to suspend you, and I say I'm going to suspend you for 3 days, and you say, well, hell, let's make it 5. Shit, let's make it 7. Why don't we expel me? Why don't we just... All of those things point to the fact that I have no emotional investment in your school, and you have no relationship with me, and I don't really give a damn about you or your school, quite frankly. And that's what kids tell us. Relationships give you credibility. Credibility gives you authority. And that credibility and authority allow you accountability and access. There's certain things that people have when they have relationships with people, they can hold people accountable. They can say certain things. And again, the kid won't take it wrong. Revising parent engagement. I know all y'all down here at the 100,000 mark, but I want y'all to read this slide. And I just want to say this, particularly about this particular side, when we start talking about parent engagement. The old notion of mom sitting at home, waiting on the call from the school, was a facade way back when. Right now, people are struggling. As I mentioned earlier with my daughter and the attempted expulsion of my daughter, I can do certain things because I'm a middle-class parent. The reality is that schools have to evolve, and I don't know that we are evolving, because as a principal, when I suspended a girl, I went to her mom and sat by candlelight to get her back in school. I'm not sure that we do that as administrators. Our schools are like green zones, like in Iraq. People have to come to them versus us going out into the community. So again, revising parental engagement or parent engagement looks like us doing some things that we didn't do. The last thing, or last couple things, the reality for some communities is that in our affluent communities, in a lot of cases, when you teach, you're just a teacher. Instructional leader, grades, lesson planning, classroom management, implement curriculum. However, in some of our most challenging communities, you're a case manager, with teaching being a part of what you do, not all of what you do. You got to be a therapist, a parent, a lesson planner, a hope leader, a seller, an idol, a disciplinarian, a cheerleader. This is school completion as it relates to a tiered system. Are we going to put this? Okay, so I don't have to necessarily go over this. This is a dropout resource guide, a document I created in Maryland that school systems use. It has alternative standards in it for alternative schools, et cetera, as evidence-based practice, and then all of what our local school systems are doing around dropout prevention. So our state success, 4-year African-American cohort rate has risen 10% to 77.5. We suspended 76,000. Now we suspend almost 15,000. 4-year African-American female cohort rate has gone up 6%. African-American females. Let me say something real quickly about African-American females before I wrap up too, because I forgot to mention this earlier. If you look at the rates of suspension, oftentimes African-American females' rates are actually worse. When you compare a white boy to black boy, those rates are not necessarily, it might be double. But when you start looking at African-American females to white females, you're looking at double, triple, quadruple, and even more of that. I don't even know what comes after quadruple. But the reality is you're looking at more of that in regards to girls to girls. So we focus oftentimes on African-American males, which we should. But I don't think we should focus on one and not the other. We should focus on African-American children as a whole, because African-American girls are catching it. And I would argue, and I didn't talk about it a whole lot in that other part, but there is a lonely existence for African-American females in schools where they are not the dominant group. Oftentimes they are left to an African-American female who's a counselor, a teacher, or maybe an assistant principal who embraces them and says, we're gonna make it through, baby. Because they don't have those ways to get into the larger community, because nobody respects women's athletics, and they aren't looked at as being bright or smart or whatever it is. So I leave you on this. Are you a waiter or are you a mechanic? Mechanics say, something wrong with you, I got to fix this. Something wrong with this, I got to fix that. I got to fix this, I got to change that. Waiter says, how can I serve you? Too often, and I think the pastor brought it up in his remarks, too often in these communities, people are mechanics. We don't pay attention to the assets that these communities have. While those assets may look different, and how they're demonstrated might be different, those assets are the same. I've never met a parent, regardless of race, socioeconomic class, or whatever, that didn't want the best for their kid. The issue was they might not have a skill set, and we can help them with skill sets. So again, I ask you, and you don't need to answer this, but this is something for you to take home with yourself, or take home with you, is are you a waiter or are you a mechanic? Because how you approach them and how you look at people is actually how you interact with them and how they perceive you. So with that, we are, I'm a little bit over, hot dog it. Thank you. There is my contact information. This is my book that will be coming out in May. That's my contact information. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we'll do,
Okay.
I think we can do 2 or 3 questions. Thank you so much, Mr. Murphy.
Yes.
Reverend Wilson talked about changing policy and how you can't change the bottom until you change the top. And you talked really only about changing policy, but yet you made those dramatic shifts. Mm-hmm. Did you do any cultural interventions or other things with your teachers in your districts?
Yes. So just about everybody in Maryland has engaged, school systems have engaged in cultural competence. We as a state hosted 4 conferences with cultural competency being a major component of what we did. Has it helped? Yes. But one of the challenges is tying it back to the classroom. So there are some people who take it and run with it. And then there are others who kind of take it and, as Reverend, you said, the recommendations, they kind of put it on the side and keep it moving forward, which to me is why the whole notion of accountability is important. Because if we're making people accountable for what we teach them, Now you can't hide behind putting it on the side or putting it on the table or ignoring it or whatever. Now you've got to actually address it and do it, or we need to move you to another seat on the bus.
Other questions?
Hi. So often when we talk about public education reform, we talk a lot about accountability of the schools. When I talk to teachers, they talk about how enthusiastic they were about entering the profession and how that changed when they were called everything but a child of God by these little blessings and miracles. That we somehow, we kind of give them a pass and we listen to them kind of in a different setting. So when they're with the teacher and they're disrupting their peers from learning, they're acting a certain way, but then when they're one-on-one with someone else, they're kind of manipulating the situation and they're conducting themselves much differently. I guess it's just, I'm not in the trenches, but it just seems that the school officials, a lot of times we have very high standards and we talk about accountability. I don't know that that same degree of accountability is for parents and children.
And I hear that quite often. And let me be very clear. There are certain groups of kids or certain students that we do have to remove. And they have to be placed in alternative programs because, quite frankly, they are dangerous to themselves or they're dangerous to their peers or whatever it is. But in our data, that's not who we're talking about. What we're talking about are surly teenage kids who might be rude, who might be nasty. But I'm going to suggest, and I push this back on educators who say that. Having been in probably the most intense classrooms, juvenile justice, special ed, I know that what I just presented to you, if you have relationships with kids, even if they do show their hind parts, which I've had over the course of 21 years, every time, whether they be special ed or correctional ed or whatever, that kid has come back to me and said, Mr. Murphy, I'm so sorry. Oftentimes within hours. Or if it happened at the end of the day, they come back the next morning, Mr. Murphy, man, I'm so sorry. I don't know, I was just upset. So I'm going to suggest that certainly there are always people at the opposite ends of the spectrum. But I'm going to suggest, and in most cases, that if you have relationships, you have classroom structure, and the kids know that you are invested in them, those problems that people talk about having are mitigated through your relationships and also your own kids. Because I can tell you when I did discipline in my class, so when I taught in the juvenile justice facility, all I heard was N-word, curse, N-word, curse, N-word, curse, N-word, curse. So one day I sat down and I said, okay, what's about to happen is this going to stop. We're not going to say the N-word, we're not going to curse. So what's going to be the consequence? They sat around, we muddled around with it for a minute, and then it was, okay, well, it's 20 push-ups. If you curse to do the N-word, it's 20 push-ups. Now, what was very funny is that I didn't even have to force the rule. They would enforce it. And here's the funny part, when Mr. Murphy stubbed his toe and said, damn, and I said it under my breath. They heard me. Mr. Murphy, you owe us 20. You right. And so they understood. Now here, let me also talk about the other part of the relationship, which is that I sat with boys who couldn't read and taught them how to read. I sat with young men and listed their problems because I knew that I couldn't teach them until we actually did 10 minutes of group therapy or 15 minutes of group therapy before we could even get to instruction because there was so much pain and so much anger. Now, them boys also rewarded me because when they was going to fight, they said, Mr. Murphy, we don't want you to get hurt, so they escorted me out the room. You guys laugh, but that's a sign of relationship, care, and investment that they thought enough of me to, literally they rose up, they stopped, get out the room. They opened the door for me, escorted me to the door. And as soon as the door shut, my desks and chairs and all kinds was flying back and forth. But they showed an amount of care for me and an amount of love for me that, and so I get what you're saying, and I'm just suggesting that teachers in those particular situations have to have better relationships as well, and that will help mitigate. You can't go into a place scared, because kids smell fear like animals smell fear. and they come at you. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry.
I wonder if you would talk for a minute about the teacher workforce, because even though the population is shifting, becoming more diverse, the reality is if you go to any of our schools of education around the state of Missouri, the overwhelming majority of students studying education are white and female, as you said.
So in Maryland, 86% of our teachers are white females. We have one of our problems, and when I talked earlier about hiring practices, where I live and where in our state, if you go 160 miles in any direction, you will run into probably 8 to 9, actually about 10 historically black colleges and universities. Because so we talk about structural stuff. Structurally, we've always looked at Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or wherever to get our teachers. But our schools are much different than they were when we created this structure. And so part of our challenge is getting people to understand that you have to go to other places to get people who look different than, or who look like the people in your population. Now, the other thing that I've heard is that the HBCU people can't pass the praxis. And the kids from Towson or Johns Hopkins can pass the praxis. And one, that's incredibly foolish to make that statement. But the other piece is they can pass the practice but can't teach a damn thing. And folks from Morgan and Coppin and you know, UMES and all these places actually can teach and reach the kids. So the question is, which one do you want to support people and get them to pass the praxis and also have a competent teaching force that actually knows the kids and experience the kids, or do you want a group that can pass the praxis but, again, can't teach the kids? Yes?
You didn't mention much about parents and their
Yes.
This is going to be the last question.
okay.
I apologize. Go ahead.
and their attitudes sometimes, or some of the parents aren't on board or at home. How do you and the schools manage to help those children where they don't have that other support?
So what we've done and what I did in my school and what I've instructed or tried to get schools to do is get multiple links. Because part of what happens is in Baltimore, and I'm just going to put Baltimore out there, folks got burners. Burners are cell phones. And so that burner is on because they got they buy some minutes at Walmart and it's 50 minutes for $50 and then they ain't got no more minutes. And so the number that you had is invalid. So what we do is we ask people for multiple numbers, multiple email addresses. So we get a mom, a dad, if there's a dad around, an aunt, a grandmother, a grandfather, et cetera. So we've got 4 or 5 different connections to communities and to families. Because quite frankly, to your point, there are some people who are unavailable. And we don't want to judge them. We understand that they're unavailable. We don't want to judge them, but we do need to have somebody who's connected in the family. So that's typically what we do is we call out to a parent, hey, can you pick up, or to an aunt or an uncle, whoever it is, such and such happened at the school. And again, that part is about relationships too, because there's some other concerns you have to worry about with law, reporting, and what happens with particular kids. But if you just say we need you to come get your kid, you can't necessarily express what happened. But if there's been a communication with the parent or aunt or uncle, whoever it is, then you can use that as a way to get other family members involved.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I
thank you.
apologize. We're a little bit behind, which we assumed,
That was me.
but we are really grateful that you were able to come to Columbia.